Richard Feynman, a post-World War II American theoretical physicist who was famous for his study on the theories of quantum mechanics and quantum electrodynamics, once said of science, in relation to how it deeply holds primary value but can equally be pernicious, that every man is given the key to the gates of heaven. The same key opens the gates of hell, and so it is with science. And the late greatly celebrated American paleontologist and evolutionary biologist Stephen Jay Gould once lamented that science is not a heartless pursuit of objective information, it is a creative human activity. And understandably so, because our natural world is a complex stage of countless discoveries, a landscape of wonder and awe awaiting to be discovered by humanity's most daring minds. A realization that compelled the world's most well-known English broadcaster and natural historian David Attenborough to exclaim that an understanding of the natural world and what's in it is a source of not only a great curiosity, but great fulfillment. And there is arguably no noble way of attaining such an understanding as compared to a well-rounded up scientific approach. But before you and I can bring our wondering minds to make that leap, it is of some significance to pause and ask, what really is science to start with? What is the scientific method? And what noble role has it played in our human story, in our history, and in our place in the world and in the universe? The answers lie in a historical time period between the 16th and 17th century that historians and scholars have come to famously call the scientific revolution. There are many academically conflicting answers as to what the scientific revolution is, but at bottom, there is a commonality in the answers that it was a sharp break from the medieval world, the Middle Ages, and into modernity. But to fully understand this historic period dubbed the scientific revolution, it is best to construe it as basically a series of events towards the end of the Renaissance period that marked the birth of modern science in Europe, primarily because empirical research and study in fields such as mathematics, physics, astronomy, biology, human anatomy, and chemistry gradually began to change the views of society about nature and about people's place in the world. But something else was special and quite unique about this revolution, mainly because before it happened, many thinkers and scholars generally decided what was true or false by recourse to Aristotelian thinking, Roman writers, Christian ideas, or the Bible. However, when an elite group of intellectuals gained insight into natural phenomena by the tentative approach to objective methods of observing and understanding nature, it spanned curiosity and the desire to gain insight into what our world was like and to understand it in a wider context as opposed to what was handed down by the church and ancient Greek philosophers. Just so as to have a full appreciation of the change in thinking that occurred during this period in the history of science, it is vital to draw some examples from very notable figures who greatly contributed to this revolution. During the Middle Ages, many scholarly thinkers believed that the Earth was an immovable object perfectly situated at the center of the universe, while the moon, the sun, and the planets all moved in perfectly circular paths around the Earth. This view held strong because it felt like a lived experience and commonsensical. Plus, for someone peering up the sky with no sophisticated machinery, the sun sure does appear to be moving around the Earth as it rises in the morning and sets in the evening. That view of the Earth and the universe was called the Geocentric Theory. This geocentric theory of the universe came from the Greek philosopher whose works shaped centuries of philosophy from late antiquity through the Renaissance, Aristotle, and in the 2nd century AD was later built upon by the Greek astronomer named Ptolemy. And this false idea perfectly blended to the falsity Christianity was propagating at the time, that God had deliberately placed the earth at the center of the universe, thus making it a special place on which the great story of life unfolded. However, just right at the beginning of the scientific revolution, somewhere around the mid-1500s, a good number of scholars began to publish works that challenged the ideas spread by Aristotle, Ptolemy, and the church. And notably, an early challenge to accepted scientific thinking came in the field of astronomy. And it all started when a small group of scholars began to cast doubt on the geocentric theory. This much-loved old theory, parroted by the church, just couldn't accurately explain the movements of the sun, the moon, and the planets. And this major problem bothered a Polish cleric, mathematician, and astronomer named Nicholas Copernicus. Copernicus was fascinated by an old Greek idea that the sun stood at the center of the universe. After studying planetary movements for more than 25 years, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy explains that Copernicus went on to propose that the sun was stationary in the center of the universe and the earth revolved around it, and this he explained through what we have come to know as the heliocentric theory. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy further adds, however, that even though Copernicus went on to create a concept of the universe in which the distances of the planets from the Sun bore a direct relationship to the size of their orbits, the idea was very controversial and was brutally repudiated by the church because it contradicted their religious views. Fearing ridicule or persecution, Copernicus did not publish his findings until 1543, the last year of his life. He received a copy of his book on the revolutions of the heavenly bodies on his deathbed. Nevertheless, it was the start of a change in the way the world was viewed, and thus Copernicus came to be seen as the initiator of the scientific revolution. And it became patently obvious that the scientific revolution was a new way of thinking about the natural world that was based upon careful observation and a willingness to question accepted beliefs. But Copernicus' theory was but a start, and over the next century and a half, other scientists built on the foundations he laid. One of those scientists was a Danish astronomer who worked at developing astronomical instruments and measuring the positions of stars, Tycho Brahe. Brahe closely observed and carefully recorded the movements of the planets for many years, producing mountains of accurate data based on his observations, and it was left to his followers to make mathematical sense of his findings. Something that an intelligent colleague of his did following Brahe's death. His name was Johannes Kepler. After studying Brahe's data, Kepler concluded that certain mathematical laws govern planetary motion. One of those laws showed that the planets revolve around the Sun in elliptical orbits instead of circles, as was previously thought. Kepler's laws showed that Copernicus' basic ideas were true. They demonstrated mathematically that the planets revolve around the Sun. However, it can be said with absolute certainty that there is no better way to understand the impact of the scientific revolution on history and the hostility with which the church responded without talking about the man of the moment, an Italian physicist and astronomer, Galileo Galilei. With the scientific revolution already underway, Galileo built on the new theories about astronomy, and in 1609, he heard about the invention of the spyglass, a device which made distant objects appear closer. Galileo used his mathematical knowledge and technical skills to improve upon the spyglass and build a telescope. Later that same year, he became the first person to look at the moon through a telescope and make his first astronomical discovery. He found that the moon was not smooth, but mountainous, just like the Earth. He subsequently used his newly invented telescope to discover 4 of the moons circling Jupiter, to study Saturn, to observe the phases of Venus, and to study sunspots on the Sun. Then in 1610, he published a small book called Starry Messenger, which described his astonishing observations. Galileo's observations strengthened his belief in Copernicus' theory that the Earth and all other planets revolved around the Sun. Most people in Galileo's time believed that the Earth was the center of the universe and that the Sun and planets revolved around it. Unfortunately, after Galileo began publishing papers about his astronomical discoveries and his belief in a heliocentric or sun-centered universe, he was caught by the church, which was extremely powerful at the time, to go to Rome to answer charges brought against him by the Inquisition. Galileo was cleared of charges of heresy, but was told that he should no longer publicly state his beliefs that Earth moved around the Sun. Galileo continued his study of astronomy and became more and more convinced that all planets revolved around the Sun. And in 1632, he published a book called Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems. This book presented the ideas of both Copernicus and Ptolemy, but it clearly showed that Galileo supported the Copernican theory. The Pope angrily summoned Galileo to Rome to stand trial before the Inquisition. Under the threat of torture, he knelt down before the cardinals and read aloud a signed confession. In it, he agreed that ideas of Copernicus were false, but was once again found guilty of heresy. Galileo was sentenced to life imprisonment, but because of his age and poor health, he was allowed to serve his imprisonment under house arrest and later died on January 8, 1642. But Copernicus, Kepler, Brahe, and Galileo are just a few among the many figures who set the scientific revolution ablaze, because this revolution was a combination of discoveries and a chain of events that helped spread its impact. For example, Lawrence Princip's book, The Scientific Revolution, A Brief History, explains that during the Renaissance, European explorers traveled to Africa, Asia, and the Americas, places that were inhabited by people and animals previously unknown in Europe. These discoveries opened Europeans to the possibility that there were truths to be found. And there was the invention of the printing press during this very period that helped spread the challenging ideas, both old and new, more widely among European thinkers. Largely because the revolution in scientific thinking that Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo ignited eventually grew into a new approach to science called the scientific method. And this method was advanced by Francis Bacon and René Descartes. And sealing up the last major pieces of the scientific revolution that Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo had left off in the field of astronomy and physics, the great English scientist who needs no introduction, Sir Isaac Newton, helped to bring together all those pieces under a single theory of motion or universal gravitation with the aid of his studies in mathematics and physics at Cambridge University. And in 1687, Newton published his ideas in a work called The Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, becoming one of the most important books ever written describing the universe as a giant clock, with parts all working together perfectly in ways that could be expressed mathematically. From Newton, much more greater discoveries in the history of science developed, leading into the Einsteins and Schrödingers of our world. And from the scientific revolution, we see brave humans who chose to live beyond the norm and dared to learn, even at the cost of death, many of whom did die in the bloodthirsty considered hands of the church, and yet they sparked in all of us young intellectuals the desire for discovery and the thirst for probing questions. The greatly celebrated American astronomer and planetary scientist Carl Sagan put it perfectly when he said, "Science is much more than a body of knowledge. It is a way of thinking. It invites us to let the facts in, even when they don't conform to our preconceptions. Science is a way of thinking much more than it is a body of knowledge. Its goal is to find out how the world works, to seek what regularities there may be, to penetrate to the connections of things from subatomic particles, which may be the constituents of all matter, to living organisms, and to the universe as a whole."